the books are all available for free by PDF or on Internet Archive now, but almost no one knows about them. And that was one of the big reasons why Tamra and I wrote this book. We just thought that the teaching was so important, that their love story was so beautiful, and that they were just such extraordinary people that we wanted a simple, small book that anybody could read, and it would be an introduction to the Betty books. So then you could go and read the Betty books and enjoy them. Tamra was the one who first got me into the Betty books. We had a friend whose name was the Reverend Edward A. Monroe, who was a Cherokee, who was also a Taos Pueblo shaman, but he was a trance channel who would fall asleep and a spirit would speak through him who had a strong Scottish brogue. And this spirit recommended that Tamra read the Betty books. Tamra was very dyslexic and an impatient reader, and she found Stewart's style to be somewhat tedious. As she would often say when she tried to read the books, why won't he get to the point? And so eventually she asked me to, as she said, translate the work of the Whites into more modern English so she could find out why Ed had and the spirit had wanted her to read them. So I was always happy to do anything for her, and I started to read the books, and I was extremely impressed by what I found in them. And that started about 40 years of research and practice based on the work of the Invisibles and of Stewart and Betty. And one of the things that was very peculiar about it was that they were extremely popular in the 1930s and in the 1940s, but they fell into total obscurity. And when we began to research them, I couldn't find information about them. So eventually I was going into court records and newspaper records and just anywhere we could think of to find something about these people. And what we found was that they lived a life that was every bit as amazing as the work that they did. So I'm going to go into a little bit of that. But the first thing I want to point out is that the kind of mediumship that Betty did was a lot different from what we run into in most cases with mediums. They were not doing work for others. They were not doing health readings or past lives or such. Betty was specifically trained to cross over while she was still in the body, and then to share with everyone not just information about what that was like and what the other side, as it were, was like, but also she was trained to give exercises and visualizations and such that would help the reader to develop these abilities. Betty believed that eventually human beings would have the ability to talk to those who have gone before us. And that's really not surprising, because if you look at the history in any area of the world, the indigenous people have ancestor worship. They are in communion with those who have gone on. And Betty was reclaiming that. But she described her mission as demonstrating the Hereness of Immortality. She said that we grow up in a society where if we believe in immortality at all, we think of it as something that's there, it's out there, or it's away from us, or that the world that those who die go to is not our world. And Betty taught something quite different. She taught that the world of the living and of the dead is one world. And the difference is simply in the frequencies that we exist on. Very similar to Plato, very similar to the ancient Taoist teachings of the secret of the golden flower, that when we're in the body, we have our spiritual senses obscured, and that many of us forget that we are actually beings that originate outside time, and that we're experiencing this particular space-time as a learning experience. And so Betty described the difference as the obstructed universe, which is where we are talking right now, and the unobstructed universe, which is where we go when we have the freedom of our consciousness outside the body. And so what she was trying to teach people was to gain that consciousness while still in the body. She also said that consciousness is the starting point for everything. So to her, everything in the world, whatever it is, no matter how humble, has some form of consciousness at its core that originates its existence in the obstructed. And the obstructed is this incredible kind of group project that's been going on for so long of creation. It could be thought of as a school or as an incredible theatrical production. Or a dream that we all share and co-create. But the Betty books are really focused on this moment that is beautifully described, I think, in the Tibetan scripture, the precious garland, where it's said that in the process of death, we arrive at this strange experience, which is what they say is the consciousness remains as an orphan with no support. And so I won't belabor this point because you all have experience with this. I'll just say that most of us, we live in this kind of cocoon of experiences that we gather, things that are precious to us, friendships and keepsakes and songs and memories and conversations, and this is how we identify ourselves. And this is how we feel stability and security and even love and friendship. But then what happens, Betty is asking, when the consciousness moves out and away from these things, when we lose all that is familiar and all that exists is what Betty described as a point of individual consciousness. So in the Betty books, there are three very important sentences. The first one is, consciousness is everything, as we've just mentioned. So we live in a fully conscious universe where the idea is that, people talk about what's the meaning of life, and Betty provided an answer to that, and the Invisibles provided an answer to that, which is that we are climbing this ladder of consciousness. And she described it this way, that how we exist in the obstructed is through a quality of consciousness. So a tree has a tree quality of consciousness. A cat has the cat quality, and a human being has a human being quality of consciousness. And within that quality, we may have multiple lives as we gather quantity of consciousness. And when we reach the most quantity of consciousness that particular quality of consciousness can sustain, we are ready to graduate to another level of quality. So we've all seen, for example, amazingly beautiful trees that just cause life to flourish around them, and sometimes they're even thought of as having divine energy. This would be a tree that has achieved perhaps the height of quantity of consciousness that a tree can achieve. And so when that tree ends its existence in the obstructed, it would graduate to another form, to another quality of consciousness where it can now add even more quantity of consciousness. And the meaning of life is to climb up that quality of consciousness and gain the utmost quantity of consciousness. And one of the things that I found particularly beautiful in the Betty books is that when asked about prayer, Betty said, someone asked, how do we address our prayers? Who are we praying to? The Invisibles were often pointing out that ideas about prayer taught in traditional religion were kind of stale, and they were more like pleading with a big guy in the sky or something, or they were just kind of repetition of traditions. And Betty said that it shouldn't be that way, that prayer should start with appreciation for all the most beautiful moments of our lives, to open our heart and mind, and that we should address prayer to consciousness, to the ultimate consciousness. Another important sentence in there is, attention is existence. So this is how our beliefs define our experience of life, in part, and it's also that literally our existence in the obstructed universe begins with our attention on creating a being in the obstructed world. And so you can see this in in the way that often our beliefs define our experience of life. If you see people who fear, for example, demonic influence, and they doubt voices that they hear, and they live in a constant sense of paranoia about being misled into damnation, that's a very different kind of life from somebody who has beliefs that think of nature as a welcoming place, a place where we find wisdom and where we are taught and where we can grow and evolve. And then the other important sentence is the individual is immortal. The Invisibles taught that once anything in the world is able to evolve to reason and to using its will, that it is now immortal. And so amoebas perhaps don't achieve immortality individually because they don't have the opportunity to contain enough quantity of consciousness to be able to come back as themselves, as their personality in a sense, their individuality. But that, for instance, a cat or a dog that is good at getting a snack out of somebody and knows how to manipulate the person who takes care of them, that this isn't immortal. And Betty was often asked about pets, and she always said, I have my dogs with me, and they are climbing up that ladder. And in fact, you can view creation of all the obstructed world as being this beautiful a mutual encouragement experience, so that the animals that we take care of, for example, look up to us and see all the things that we can do. You know, like we have thumbs and we can open cans of food, and they want to achieve that. They want to be able to communicate. They want to be able to do more things, and we all do that for each other, hopefully. And we encourage each other to become better and greater and to attain greater quantities of consciousness as we climb the ladder of quality of consciousness. So I just wanted to give you a touch of their teachings before I told you a little bit about them. They, like I said, lived amazing lives. So Stewart was born in 1873. And this was a man's man kind of guy. He wasn't a son of a very wealthy family, but his father made sure that he experienced life in all its most demanding ways. So he was a lumberjack, he was a gold miner, he was somebody who explored frontiers in America and in Africa. Eventually he became a writer, much to his father's chagrin. But he proved to be a very successful writer. He wrote westerns and adventure stories, particularly stories for boys. And his books were made into films by Disney and by other early film companies. And he was the kind of man who, for example, a story was told about him that he broke his leg once when he was on a trail in the wilderness. And he had to drag himself several miles to get back to camp. But along the way, he shot a game bird and then crawled out to get it and bring it back so that there would be dinner. He was somebody who, when he was on safari in Africa, one of the porters was attacked by a leopard, and he did not have time to get his gun, so he strangled the leopard. He has a redwood grove, a sequoia grove, named after him in California. He was a friend of Teddy Roosevelt, and he was one of the people that made Teddy Roosevelt such a great conservationist. And Teddy was infamously didn't respect indigenous Americans, but Stewart tried to help him to respect indigenous Americans. And in his biography, Teddy describes Stewart as the best shot with a rifle or pistol that he ever met. So this rough frontiersman who had nothing to do with spirituality, in 1904 meets Betty. Betty was 6 years younger. She was a lot shorter. She was barely 5 feet. She'd been raised in Panama and in Bermuda and in Florida with a very wealthy family. And it took quite a while for Stewart to convince her parents that he was a good match for her. And they must have been horrified when they announced that the first thing they were going to do together, their honeymoon, was going to be 4 months in the wilderness of the Sierras when there was nothing there. But she loved it, and she adapted immediately. The first thing that Stewart noticed about her, besides her incredible zest for life, everything was just joyous that she experienced, was when they had an adventure where they were walking in a stream out in the wilderness, and they turned a bend, and a 1,000-pound Kodiak bear was coming right at them, having come the other way. And Betty was walking considerably in front of Stewart, and Stewart did not have his gun with him. And this could have been a deadly encounter. But when Betty saw the bear, she pointed at it and she said, "Now you be a good bear and you go away." And Stewart said that the bear put his ears down like a guilty dog and then kind of turned around and walked away. And he said that he saw her do these kinds of things hundreds of times. He told another touching story about the Santa Barbara Zoo, where there was this beautiful male lion that was living a very bored and unhappy life. And Betty stood for a long time staring at him. And then as she walked away, this lion got up and he came to the corner of the stage and watched her until she disappeared. And then Stewart ran after Betty and said, "What did you do to that lion?" And what she did was she, having been in Africa in lion country, she sent the lion pictures of where the lion should have been, its natural habitat. And the lion obviously received those pictures. They lived a very romantic life. They had a yacht called the Reckless, and he used to say, "Be careful how you spell it," because they spelled it with a W. And their idea of a vacation was to get on the yacht without any crew except a cat. And they would hug the coast from Santa Barbara to Alaska when Alaska was wilderness. And they would go camping out together for weeks and then come back to Santa Barbara. All this changes in 1919 at a friend's St. Patrick's Day party. This friend had been working with a Ouija board. And this was a frivolous, festive kind of an occasion. They didn't use the planchette, they used a whiskey glass. And Betty wasn't really into it. She had heard bad things about Ouija boards and she didn't want to get involved. They kept teasing her about it. Well, the Ouija board started spelling out Betty, Betty, Betty. She thought they were playing a trick on her. But eventually she came over to prove that she wasn't scared. And when she did, the whiskey glass went around in what Stewart described as happy circles, like a puppy. And then it started saying over and over again, "Get a pencil, get a pencil." It took a little while, a couple days, for Betty to get a piece of paper and a pencil sitting at her vanity, feeling very foolish. And automatic writing began. But it was very slow. One word might take an hour at first. But she reported back to Stewart, who was very skeptical of it. He thought that spiritualism had long ago been proven to be a fraud. And so he said that for a long time he couldn't accept the messages that started coming through. But he said that eventually he was driven to accept it. He said there was so much evidence that to reject it became more ridiculous than to believe in it. And eventually the spirits, the invisibles, said, "No more automatic writing." And they were disappointed. They thought this was the end of the experiment. But then Stewart was traveling and he found a copy of a book, a famous spiritualist book by authors whose pseudonyms were Darby and Joan, which used to be American slang for a happily married couple. Darby was a newspaper man, and Joan was a writer, an early feminist writer, actually. And so this book really spoke to them, and this medium had begun as an automatic writer and then became a voice medium. So they reached out to Darby and Joan and said, "Can you help us learn how to do this?" They became lifelong friends, and indeed Joan taught Betty how to become a voice medium. Betty was unique in some ways in that she did not go into trance and lose herself. She remained aware and would comment on what was coming through from the invisibles. Sometimes she spoke in a different voice, sometimes with a strong Gaelic accent. And sometimes voices seemed, rarely, but sometimes, to come from around her and not through her. So they published a series of books, the famous Betty books, the first one in 1925. And at first, Stewart was very careful. He admitted where the information came from, that it was through mediumship, but he basically said, I like this philosophy of life, and let me explain it to you. And he did not say that my wife is the person who's actually channeling this stuff. In 1939, they finished a book called Across the Unknown, which would become, in some ways, one of their most important books. They had decided to reveal Betty's identity, and they went deeply into detail about the purpose of life and the experience of death. But they were also getting messages from the invisibles that something was going to change. There were hints that were dropped. They called it a lightening of density. They said that this would be uncomfortable but necessary. And they said that it was like a flower that would bloom for the work, and that if the flower never bloomed, then the work really wouldn't be complete. Well, Betty, who'd been healthy all her life, suddenly got very ill. Stewart thought that this was the big mission, to heal Betty, to demonstrate the power of spirit, because they had talked about the healing power of what they called spiritual contact and spiritual stability. So Betty steadily declined, and Stewart was insistent that she keep fighting. And so there's this very poignant moment in the book where Stewart describes how Betty says to him, you know, it would be so easy for me to go. I have to fight it in the night. Would it be so bad if I just went? And Stewart says, no, you can't do that. You'll ruin the whole work. We've got to get you better. Well, the poor girl got so weak that she was going in and out of coma, basically, and could only speak a word at a time. And she was back home now, and the doctor was with her one night, and it finally dawned on Stewart what he was doing, that he was making her suffer. And so he sat down in his favorite chair, and he talked to her in his mind. And he said, Betty, if it's time to go, don't let me stop you. I'll be okay. Please. I don't want you to suffer anymore. Well, 2 minutes later, the doctor came out of the room, and she had passed. And the doctor had a peculiar look on his face, and he said that something extraordinary had happened, which was this woman who was so weak that she could barely speak a word, had suddenly sat up in bed, and the beautiful smile that lit up a room that everybody described was back on her face. And she said to the doctor, it's okay, Doc. I had a talk with my boy, and everything's okay now. And she died. Now, we do have in medical literature these kinds of experiences where people who supposedly do not have the brain capacity any longer to speak will, at the moment of death, will suddenly have this energy and will communicate. It's a mystery in medicine, but it is recorded. And Betty certainly did demonstrate this. But beyond that, Stewart says that as he sat there in that chair and felt this loss of this incredible woman that he'd spent his life with, he felt suddenly this inundation of what he said was like this cozy, intimate feeling of companionship. He compared it to reading a book in a room with someone you love, like you're reading one book, they're reading another one. You're not even looking at each other, but yet you feel each other's presence. And he talked about how this is something that we all seek in our relationships. It's a bond of intimacy that you experience in your mutual habits, in your travels together, in your conversations with each other, and in your most intimate moments. But he said that this feeling that he had then was 1,000-fold. It flooded him to such a degree that his grief was completely washed away, and he realized that this was Betty loving him and letting him know, I'm here with you. So he had to write a new chapter for the end of the book in which he described this. And he thought that this must be what the Invisibles were talking about, that this was the consummation of the work. And the book was an instant bestseller, it was hugely influential, and it was released just before the Blitzkrieg in Poland, right before World War II began. So Betty left right before that. And this was not the end, that it had just begun, actually. What happened next was stunning. Betty began to appear all over the place and began to bring messages to people, and often practical jokes, and her humor was completely intact, and her personality. And so the interesting thing was that Stewart, however, wasn't getting the messages except through others, not personally. And he also refused any seances. He later admitted that on one level he felt like it was wrong to be sentimental and lonely and then to ask her to come and comfort him. He felt somehow it was disrespectful of the work that they had done together and of the feeling of her continuing love and presence that was in his heart. But he also admitted that he was afraid that if it was a bad session, that it might shake his faith. And he wasn't willing to do that because he felt so strongly that she was there. Of course, his life became lonely, and this incredible collection of plants that she had brought from their travels that was in their backyard. And she also brought many plants to Southern California, plants that have become symbols of Southern California, like the bird of paradise, were brought here by Betty. And these plants all began to die. And Stewart, who was quite wealthy, hired the best horticulturalists. Nobody could keep them alive. They obviously wanted to be there for Betty, and once Betty was gone, they didn't care to live on. And he didn't want to watch this happen. So he got lots of invitations from friends who said, come stay with us. Not long before Pearl Harbor, he basically toured the country, visiting his friends and getting their condolences and their support. And the last people he visited were Darby and Joan. And Joan said, how about we do a session? And he said, okay, but please don't get Betty. Let's just talk to your guide, okay? And Joan said, absolutely, I won't go looking for Betty. We'll just talk to my guide. Well, the minute she went under, Betty just stormed in. And the first thing she did was she called him by a nickname that she never said in front of anybody but him, which was Stewart. And then she spent, according to him, 2.5 hours of absolutely fluent, intimate knowledge of their common experience in living. No fishing, no fumbling. It was almost ridiculous, he said. It was just pouring out a series of authentications, dozens of small events from their past, trivialities from their marriage, and things that could not possibly be within Joan's knowledge, including things that embarrassed him so much that he said, Betty, please, what if Joan remembers this? And Betty reassured him she won't. In that reading, she said, by the way, please pay back Joan for the red lacquer box. So he asked Joan, what is the red lacquer box? Do you know about that? And Joan said, oh my God, yes. She said, I was on a bus one day and I had this compulsion to go on the wrong bus and go all the way across town to this store. And I went into the store and I saw this red lacquer box with sparrows carved on it, a Chinese box. And I was obsessed with it. I had to have it. They told me it was a sample and I couldn't buy it and they were out of them. And I was so insistent that I said, you go look in the back. There's got to be one there for me. And sure enough, they found one more that was left behind. It was a return. And so they sold it to her. Now she's on the bus going home with this red lacquer box and she realizes, I don't need this. I have lacquer boxes. Why did I buy this? Am I going crazy? Betty mentioned, this is a gift for my sister Millicent. So Stewart took this to his sister-in-law, and first he asked her, did you ever talk about a red lacquer box with Betty? And she said, yes, as a matter of fact, I saw a beautiful one in Chinatown in San Francisco, and I really wanted it, but it was so expensive. And then later I regretted it, and I wrote several letters to Betty about it, but she never responded. And then he said, Betty said that the important thing about the box is the carving. And so Millicent looked at it and realized it was swallows, and she started crying. And she explained to Stewart that every spring, Betty, her older sister, would help her climb into a tree where swallows were nesting so she could watch the little birds as they were hatched and watch them grow up and become fledglings. So having this incredible demonstration and others like it and getting all these letters was an amazing experience for Stewart. And his life settled into being a kind of source of solace for people in the war. Pearl Harbor occurred. The book that was the next book published, The Unobstructed Universe, which became their best bestseller, was reprinted every 2 months for a year because they couldn't keep it in print. It was so popular. And an interesting thing about that book is that, and not just that book, but in general the Betty books, is they were a big influence on Carl Jung. And Carl Jung would give Betty books to his colleagues, and he especially recommended The Unobstructed Universe. But he was funny. In public, he would always kind of be agnostic about it. He would say that Stewart's writing was ghastly. He would say that the Betty books have an Americanized, kind of mechanized view of the afterlife that was hard to take. But then on the other hand, he would also say that he found them immensely interesting and immensely inspiring. And he said that people who wanted, for example, to understand his technique of creative imagination, something he'd been doing for 30 years to help people with neurosis, that they should read the Betty books. And then eventually he got a German edition published, which he wrote the preface for. And there again, he was vague about it. He didn't want to appear like somebody who believed in spiritualism. He thought that that would compromise his reputation. But in his private letters, particularly in a letter that he wrote to a friend of his named Franz Kunkel, he admitted that, as he said, Betty behaves like a real woman, the posthumous Betty, and not an anima figure. And he said that he was hesitant to deny her reality as a spirit, and that he thought that she was both a spirit and an archetype. So in other words, Jung is saying that he considered Betty's posthumous communication to be evidence of the survival of consciousness after death. And you can see in Jung's work many of the ideas in the Betty books. So there's no question that this was something that strongly influenced him. Jung actually had a great deal of experience with spiritualism, which is often left out. People think of him as into alchemy and such, but they don't realize that, for instance, his dissertation was about a seance that he was involved in with his 13-year-old cousin, and that he himself had channeling experiences and experiences with spirit hauntings and such. But there's no question that in ideas like the shadow and in some of the things that he said, which could be really right out of the Betty books. Like, for example, he once said that he got this letter from a pastor whose brother had died in an attack from an animal in Africa. And the pastor was kind of stunned because his brother showed up and had a chat with him. And so he wrote Carl Jung and asked him, what do you think happened to me? And Carl Jung wrote back this kind of complicated note about the psyche has the ability to nullify space and time. He said it's very probable that what we call consciousness is contained in space-time, but the unconscious exists in a relative spacelessness and timelessness. But then 11 years later, in another letter, he wrote something that could have been right out of the Betty books. He said, it's only physical phenomena that happen in a distinct place at a distinct time. The spirit is eternal and everywhere. And that is exactly what Betty described. So it's interesting to note that Carl Jung was somebody who vouched for this, and so was Who's Who, by the way, because the year that Betty passed, after they encountered the writing of Stewart about it, they did not give her a death date. And when they were written by people who said, you know, there's a mistake in the book, they said, no, there's no mistake. You should read the Betty books and you'll understand why we did that. So this was such a great source of solace during the war. There were experiences that occurred, for example, like Stewart suddenly had a knock on the door one day, and this young woman was there, and she said that she had been automatic writing, and she got the message, if something happens to me, go find SEW. And her brother, who was fighting the Nazis in Europe, had turned her on to the books of Stewart Edward White. And so she found Stewart, and as a result, she came to him and said, could you please check on my brother and tell me if he's okay? Well, Stewart told her, I can't do that. That's not really in my skill set, but why don't you sit down and we'll talk about the unobstructed universe and what happens when we die. And when the woman came home, she found a telegram telling her that her brother had died. And she wrote Stewart and said, I don't think I would have survived if you had not talked to me about this. And during that time, because of the incredible success of his books, people tried to get Stewart to start an organization, to become like a guru in a sense. But Stewart refused. He had a horror of, as he said, meddling with people's lives. One of his sayings was, every fellow has to find his path for himself. So let's talk about a couple of the things that are in the book that are, I think, are especially interesting. And one of them is they describe how we create something in the obstructed universe. And so they called it juxtaposition. And juxtaposition is a power that we get from the imagination. And the way we create something here is we take a frequency and we collide it with what they called receptivity and with conductivity. But frequency is also motion, receptivity is time, and conductivity is space. And when you combine these three things together with the imagination of the unobstructed, you create an arrestment that produces a manifestation in the obstructed. And then as long as this thing exists in the obstructed, it exists by what they called intraposition. So in other words, the soul must remain connected to whatever this thing is for it to survive in the obstructed universe. And one of the ways we can look at this is that our bodies, which are these aggregates, as they say in Buddhism, the cells and the organs and all these things that have to be harmonized, that the soul has to orchestrate like some kind of massive musical ensemble, that all of these things are experiencing a kind of eternity through the presence of the soul. And that eternity is sustained health through time. Even though it's limited, these disorganized elements of the world experience this incredible harmony of cooperation and this ability to exist together through time thanks to the presence of the soul. And other ideas that I think are fascinating in the books are the idea of aging as being a kind of collective hypnosis and superstition. So I don't know if you have this in the UK or wherever all of you are, but for instance in America, there's a big market of birthday cards that are telling you if you turn 30 years old, you're going to lose your hair, or you're going to get fat, or there's like these superstitions about what happens to you at certain stages of life. And we've all, I'm sure, met people who are 60 and they seem 30, and people who are 30 and they seem 60, and usually that's blamed on genetics. But according to the Invisibles, it has more to do with our beliefs. And so if we grow up with a group of people, family and friends and our schoolmates, and we all expect to experience the same thing at the same time, we're going to get our job, we're going to get married, we're going to have kids, we're going to get diabetes. Like it's our medical system here in America is all based on statistics, and so you're likely to get this disease when you reach this age, and you're constantly being told these things, and so you create them. And the Invisible said that if we could give up the superstition of aging, we would be shocked at how youthful we could stay. And Betty was an example of this. Betty, according to Stewart and their friends, was someone who, when she was in her mid-50s when she passed, still seemed to be 25. She had her natural hair color, she had smooth skin, she had the body that she'd had all her life. And Stewart believed that was because of her soul being so strong in her body and her beliefs being such that she didn't go for that ride. Another thing that they talked about that I found fascinating was, when people talk about spiritualism, they worry about possession by spirits. And this is one of the great things that Christianity has used in order to attack spiritualism. And the Invisible said that much more dangerous than possession by spirits is possession by the living. That so many of our lives are derailed because our family or our friends or the people we work with literally possess us. They tell us what we should be, how we should be, and what our lives will be like. And we lose track of what we came here to accomplish. The Invisibles talk about one reason why our world is such a mess is because so many spirits, when they incarnate, forget why they came here. And so many are possessed by the need to make money or by competition or by envy and all these kinds of derailing experiences. And as a result, the things that should have happened to make the world a better place don't happen. And then it's left to the next guy to clean up the mess if that person doesn't forget that why they came here. And so possession by the living, they said, is something that you wake up from if you're fortunate, and you may feel that you've lost your life, but that once you realize that it happened, your original life direction and mission would assert itself, and your destiny would still be achieved. They also talked about the vortex, and the vortex is what we fall into when we forget our spirituality and our missions. So we begin to become angry and frightened, and we're filled with apprehension, and we feel that the world is a very threatening place, and we can easily get sucked into this by other people, so that even if you do have some kind of spiritual stability and spiritual contact, if you're around the kind of people that they actually called bloodsuckers, you can feel this drain of your energy. You can be pulled into their problems. You can lose your equanimity and suddenly feel that life is something terrible. And so they taught methods of how to resist the vortex. And the most important one was relaxed appreciation. The same thing as prayer. The same thing if you want to contact spirituality, your own spirit or somebody else's. The beginning is to relax and to go over all the beautiful memories that you have, all the beautiful moments, all the divine immanence that you've experienced in your life. And when you do that, your heart and mind open and you become spiritually available. And so this is a wonderful practice, for example, I found in dealing with insomnia, that you can lay there and go over all the beautiful moments of your life. And when I speak briefly about my experiences, I'll show you a good example of how that can go even further. And another thing I loved about their work is that it's really about love and fun. Like, they want you to have fun. They say that if your spiritual path makes you anxious or depressed, then you're on the wrong path. It's supposed to be wholesome. It's supposed to be natural. You're supposed to be having fun. And Stewart always recommended to use the meditations for fun so that when you needed them, when you're facing something that was truly challenging or frightening, you would have already exercised them. But if you tried to just turn them on when something bad happened without having that experience, you really wouldn't be able to do very much. And love, he felt, was such a strong force in terms of what makes these spiritual connections happen. And certainly in his life, he felt that Betty was there, first guiding him when she was in the body, and then eventually guiding him directly, because the last book that was published posthumously by him, which was called The Job of Living, was something that he had channeled, partially from spirits that had worked with Betty, and partially from Betty herself. And he would spend an hour every day in Betty's, she had this blue room, and he would meditate and commune with her, so he knew how to answer people who were writing him, and he knew how to conduct his life for the years that he had left. He spent his time gardening, and he would go see movies by himself. He loved movies. He would write more books, and kind of, she left 1,000,000 words of channeling. And he found amazing things, like there was a whole section of writing that had happened over years, and he was told, get the first sentence from each day and put them all together. And when he did, it was a perfectly organized book. So those adventures sustained him. And then the war ended. He didn't last long after that, about 1.5 years, and then he also passed. They just were a tremendous influence during that time. And then, as I mentioned, the weird thing is that they kind of just disappeared. And I think this is because, one, they didn't have children. And in the world of metaphysics, often books survive because the copyright is inherited by the child, by the grandchild, and they can still make money off it, so they keep the book in print. In this case, the copyrights were part of a trust that belonged to a bank, and that bank failed and was acquired by another bank. And that bank failed and was acquired by another bank. And it's my belief that the copyrights, which I think are still valid, I don't think that the bank that owns them knows that they own them. There were times, like in the 1960s, when the books were reprinted by the bank that owned them then, in these kind of little paperbacks you would get at airports or hotel lobbies, and they had these crazy psychedelic covers on them. It was during the time that the Seth books by James Roberts were very popular, and also Edgar Cayce became popular. And so somebody figured out it was a way for the bank to make some money, and they put them out there. But since then, they have not been published except by people who ignore the copyright and do print on demand through Amazon or something like that. The books are all available for free by PDF or on Internet Archive now, but almost no one knows about them. And that was one of the big reasons why Tamra and I wrote this book. We just thought that the teaching was so important, that their love story was so beautiful, and that they were just such extraordinary people, that we wanted a simple, small book that anybody could read, and it would be an introduction to the Betty books. So then you could go and read the Betty books and enjoy them.